December 23rd, 1987, Salem, Oregon. The snowflakes were gently tapping against the windows of St. Mary's Hospital when 24-year-old Lisa Harper completed her final rounds in the intensive care unit. She glanced at her watch, 11:47 p.m. The pre-Christmas shift was finally coming to an end, and Lisa was thinking about the cookie baking plans she had with her mother Margaret for the next day. "Good night, Lisa," said security guard Bob Wilson with his usual warm smile. The 52-year-old Bob had been working at the hospital for 8 years and was known by everyone as the friendly face who always had a kind word for the night shift workers. His gray mustache and gentle demeanor made him a father figure to many of the younger staff members. Lisa grabbed her burgundy winter coat from her locker, the same one her parents had given her for her nursing school graduation 6 months earlier. She was excited about finally having her own place, a small apartment just 12 minutes from the hospital, and the independence that came with her first real job. The ICU position at St. Mary's was demanding, but Lisa loved the work and had already impressed her supervisors with her dedication and skill. The employee parking lot was nearly empty, except for Lisa's 1985 Honda Civic and 2 other vehicles belonging to the skeleton crew working the overnight shift. The December air bit at her cheeks as she started her car, waiting for the heater to warm up while scraping frost from the windshield. The radio played softly, a Christmas song that made her smile and think about tomorrow's family gathering. What happened in the next 17 minutes would haunt Salem for nearly 3 decades. At 12:04 a.m. on December 24th, Oregon State Police received a 911 call from a truck driver named James Mitchell, who had been traveling southbound on Highway 22 when he discovered Lisa's Honda sitting in the middle of the road with both doors wide open. The engine was running, the headlights were on, and Christmas music was still playing from the radio, but Lisa was nowhere to be found. The scene that greeted Detective Ray Kowalski defied explanation. Lisa's purse sat untouched on the passenger seat, containing her wallet with $67 in cash and her credit cards. Her keys dangled from the ignition, and her nursing bag remained in the back seat with all her medical equipment intact. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no evidence of violence. Most puzzling of all was the complete absence of footprints in the fresh snow around the vehicle, as if Lisa had simply vanished into thin air. The only clues were a broken stethoscope found 20 feet from the car and, most mysteriously, a hospital security office key lying on the driver's seat, a key that Lisa should never have had access to. The investigation begins. Detective Kowalski had seen plenty of missing persons cases during his 15 years with the Salem Police Department, but Lisa Harper's disappearance presented challenges unlike anything in his experience. The physical evidence made no sense. How does someone disappear from a running car without leaving footprints in snow? How does a nurse end up with a security key that only 3 people in the hospital were authorized to possess? The investigation's early focus centered on Lisa's personal life and relationships. Her boyfriend, Michael Torres, a 26-year-old mechanic who worked at the local Ford dealership, became the primary suspect despite his seemingly solid alibi. Michael claimed he had been home watching television on the night Lisa disappeared, but he lived alone and had no witnesses to corroborate his story. Under intense questioning, Michael's account of his relationship with Lisa revealed some troubling details. They had argued 2 weeks before her disappearance about her working late shifts, and several witnesses reported seeing them have a heated discussion outside the hospital cafeteria. Michael's financial troubles, he owed $3,000 in credit card debt, provided a potential motive if Lisa had refused to lend him money. The community's response split along predictable lines. Lisa's nursing school classmates and hospital colleagues defended Michael, describing him as devoted to Lisa and incapable of violence. But others, particularly Lisa's mother Margaret, suspected that Michael was hiding something. His nervous behavior during police interviews and his decision to hire a lawyer after just 2 days of questioning only fueled suspicion. suspicions. The local media coverage intensified the pressure on law enforcement to solve the case quickly. The Salem Statesman-Journal ran daily front-page stories with headlines like "Nurse Vanishes Without Trace" and "Christmas Mystery Baffles Police." Television crews from Portland descended on the small city, interviewing anyone willing to discuss Lisa's disappearance and speculating about potential suspects. By February 1988, with no new evidence and mounting public pressure, District Attorney Patricia Hayes made the controversial decision to charge Michael Torres with Lisa's murder despite the absence of a body or definitive proof of foul play. The case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and the unexplained security key, which prosecutors argued Michael must have given Lisa for some unknown reason. The trial that followed exposed the weaknesses in the state's case. Michael's defense attorney successfully challenged the timeline, pointing out that numerous witnesses had seen Lisa alive after Michael claimed to have gone home. The security key remained unexplained, but the defense argued that its presence in Lisa's car was more likely connected to her work at the hospital than to any relationship with Michael. After deliberating for 18 hours, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. Michael Torres walked free, but the damage to his reputation and his relationship with the community proved irreparable. He left Salem within a month of his acquittal, moving to Seattle, where he hoped to rebuild his life away from the suspicions and whispers that had consumed his hometown. Margaret's obsession. Lisa Harper's mother, Margaret, had always been a methodical woman. As a mathematics teacher at Salem High School, she approached problems with systematic precision, breaking complex equations down into manageable components until solutions emerged. When her daughter disappeared, Margaret applied the same analytical approach to the investigation, transforming her basement into a command center that would consume the next 28 years of her life. The basement of Margaret's modest ranch house became a shrine to organization and desperate hope. Filing cabinets lined the concrete walls, filled with police reports, witness statements, and newspaper clippings arranged in chronological order. A large corkboard displayed photographs of Lisa, maps of the surrounding area, and timeline charts that Margaret updated constantly as new information emerged. She had converted the space into what she called Lisa's room, a place where she could work undisturbed on the investigation that had become her life's mission. Margaret's daily routine never varied. She woke at 5:30 a.m., prepared for her teaching duties, and spent her mornings in the classroom, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But every afternoon, at 3:45 p.m., she descended those 13 steps to the basement where her real work began. She corresponded with other families of missing persons, researched similar cases across the Pacific Northwest, and maintained detailed logs of every phone call, every tip, every potential lead that might bring Lisa home. The toll on Margaret's marriage revealed itself gradually. Her husband Robert, an accountant who preferred order and predictability, initially supported her investigation efforts. But as months turned to years and Margaret's obsession deepened, Robert found himself living with a woman who seemed to exist only in the past. Their conversations became functional exchanges about household maintenance and work schedules. Margaret forgot birthdays and anniversaries, missed family gatherings, and eventually stopped sleeping in their shared bedroom, preferring to rest on the basement couch where she could be close to Lisa's case files. The divorce papers were filed in 1994, 7 years after Lisa's disappearance. Robert remarried 2 years later, but Margaret remained alone with her investigation, supported by her teacher's pension and an unwavering belief that persistence would eventually reveal the truth about what happened to her daughter. Margaret's relationship with law enforcement cycled through phases of cooperation, frustration, and eventual antagonism. She called the Salem Police Department weekly during the first 5 years, providing new theories and demanding updates on the investigation's progress. As the case grew cold and detective assignments changed, Margaret found herself explaining Lisa's story repeatedly to officers who viewed her as a persistent nuisance rather than a grieving mother seeking justice. The emergence of the internet in the mid-1990s gave Margaret new tools for her research, but also exposed her to a community of amateur investigators and conspiracy theorists who offered hope and heartbreak in equal measure. She joined online forums dedicated to missing persons cases, shared Lisa's story on early websites, and corresponded with psychics and private investigators who claimed they could solve the mystery for the right price. By 2005, Margaret's basement contained 47 filing cabinets, over 300 VHS tapes of television coverage, and approximately 15,000 photographs related to Lisa's case. She had interviewed hundreds of people, traveled thousands of miles following leads, and spent her life savings pursuing theories that invariably led nowhere. Friends stopped visiting, colleagues at school began avoiding her during lunch breaks, and Margaret's world contracted until it contained only herself and the mystery of her daughter's disappearance. False leads and dead ends. The years following Lisa Harper's disappearance attracted the usual collection of attention seekers, con artists, and genuinely confused individuals who complicated the investigation with false confessions and misleading information. Detective Kowalski and later his successors found themselves pursuing hundreds of tips that consumed valuable time and resources while advancing the case no closer to resolution. In 1991, a drifter named Tommy Brennan contacted police from a jail cell in Portland, claiming he had witnessed Lisa's abduction while camping illegally near Highway 22. Brennan's story contained specific details about the weather conditions and location that seemed promising until investigators discovered he had been incarcerated in California on December 23, 1987. His information had come from newspaper coverage he had memorized during previous jail stays, a common pattern among false confessors seeking attention or attempting to negotiate better treatment from authorities. The most convincing false suspect emerged in 1995 when hospital administrators discovered that a former maintenance worker named Carl Hendricks had been dismissed from St. Mary's in January 1988 for stealing medical equipment. Hendricks had access to security keys, knew Lisa's schedule, and had a history of inappropriate behavior toward female staff members. The investigation into Hendricks consumed 6 months and significant resources, including attempts to track his movements across 3 states where he had worked at various medical facilities. The case against Hendricks collapsed when investigators discovered employment records proving he had been working at a hospital in Denver on the night Lisa disappeared. His dismissal from St. Mary's had been related to theft of morphine for his own use, not any involvement in Lisa's disappearance, but the months spent investigating him had diverted attention from other potential leads. Margaret Harper pursued her own parallel investigations, often traveling hundreds of miles to interview individuals who claimed knowledge of Lisa's fate. Most demanded money in exchange for information that proved worthless, but desperation and maternal hope overrode Margaret's natural skepticism. She paid $500 to a psychic in Eugene who claimed to have visions of Lisa trapped in an underground chamber, leading to a week-long search of abandoned mine shafts that yielded nothing but exhaustion and disappointment. The introduction of DNA testing in the late 1990s raised hopes that trace evidence from Lisa's abandoned car might finally provide answers. However, the evidence collection techniques of 1987 had not been designed to preserve genetic material, and most samples had deteriorated beyond usability. The few items that could be tested, including hair fibers found on Lisa's coat, failed to produce viable DNA profiles that could be compared against potential suspects. The breakthrough detective, Janet Sullivan, arrived at the Salem Police Department in 2014 with a master's degree in forensic science and extensive experience in cold case investigations. At 34, Sullivan represented a new generation of investigators who understood the potential of advanced forensic techniques and digital evidence analysis. Her first review of Lisa Harper's case file identified several evidence preservation failures from 1987, but she also noticed items that previous investigators had overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While examining photographs of Lisa's abandoned car, Sullivan noticed that crime scene technicians had collected a coffee cup from the vehicle's cup holder, apparently assuming it contained Lisa's DNA for comparison purposes. The cup had been stored in a paper evidence bag and forgotten for 27 years. Its potential significance overlooked by investigators who lacked access to modern DNA analysis technology. Sullivan submitted the coffee cup to the Oregon State Crime Lab with a request for expedited processing, understanding that trace amounts of saliva might have survived despite the evidence's age. The lab's response arrived 8 weeks later with results that transformed the investigation. The cup contained DNA from 2 individuals, one profile matching Lisa Harper's known DNA from her hairbrush, and a second profile from an unknown male subject. The unknown DNA profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which compared the genetic markers against millions of profiles from convicted criminals and unsolved cases across the United States. The initial search produced no matches, indicating that Lisa's abductor had never been arrested for a felony crime requiring DNA submission. Sullivan understood that traditional investigative methods had reached their limits and began exploring forensic genetic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that used commercial ancestry databases to identify suspects through their genetic relationships to distant relatives. Working with a specialized laboratory in Virginia, Sullivan submitted the unknown male's DNA profile for comparison against genealogy databases containing millions of consumer genetic profiles. The genealogy analysis took 4 months of computer processing and genetic research. The technique involved constructing family trees for genetic matches and using demographic information to narrow potential suspects based on age, geographic location, and other factors relevant to the 1987 timeframe. When the results arrived in Sullivan's email inbox on March 15, 2015, they contained information that would shatter Salem's understanding of the Lisa Harper case. The unknown DNA profile matched genetic markers associated with a man who had been in plain sight for 28 years. Bob Wilson, the hospital security guard who had said goodnight to Lisa on the evening she disappeared. The arrest. Bob Wilson had maintained the same routine for 28 years. He arrived at St. Mary's Hospital at 10 p.m., made his security rounds every 2 hours, and signed out at 6 a.m. with the reliability of a Swiss watch. Colleagues respected him as the steady presence who had trained dozens of younger security guards and never missed a shift despite his advancing age. At 80, Bob moved more slowly than in his earlier years, but his gentle demeanor and institutional knowledge made him indispensable to the hospital's night operations. Detective Sullivan's surveillance of Bob Wilson began on March 20th, 2015, 5 days after the DNA match confirmation arrived from the genealogy laboratory. Sullivan parked her unmarked vehicle in the hospital visitors' parking area, watching through binoculars as the man she now knew had murdered Lisa Harper went about his nightly duties with the same calm professionalism he had displayed for nearly 3 decades. The psychological profile that Sullivan commissioned from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit painted a disturbing picture of compartmentalization and manipulation. Bob represented a category of offender that law enforcement found particularly challenging: individuals who constructed elaborate facades of normalcy while harboring predatory behaviors that remained hidden from even their closest associates. His ability to maintain employment at the scene of his crime while concealing his guilt suggested a level of psychological control that had allowed him to avoid detection for 28 years. Sullivan's investigation revealed that Bob had deliberately inserted himself into the search efforts for Lisa, volunteering for weekend search parties and offering comfort to Margaret Harper during the early days of the investigation. Hospital records showed that he had worked overtime during the weeks following Lisa's disappearance, ostensibly helping with increased security measures, but actually positioning himself to monitor the investigation's progress. The arrest took place on April 2, 2015 at 5:47 a.m. As Bob completed his final security round. Sullivan approached him in the hospital's main corridor, the same hallway where he had said goodnight to Lisa Harper 28 years earlier. Bob offered no resistance when Sullivan read him his rights, displaying the calm demeanor of someone who had been expecting this moment for decades. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out," Bob told Sullivan during the drive to the police station. His voice carried the same gentle tone that hundreds of hospital employees had learned to associate with safety and reliability. "I knew eventually the science would catch up to me." The confession. The interrogation room at the Salem Police Department had witnessed countless confessions over the decades, but Bob Wilson's methodical dismantling of 28 years of deception created an atmosphere that veteran investigators would later describe as uniquely disturbing. Bob waived his right to an attorney with the same matter-of-fact demeanor he had displayed when making his security rounds, explaining to Detective Sullivan that he had been preparing for this conversation since DNA testing became commonplace in criminal investigations. Bob's confession began with his admission that Lisa Harper had not been his first victim. Over the course of 12 hours of interviews, he revealed details about 3 other young women who had disappeared from the Salem area between 1983 and 1995, cases that had never been connected due to the geographical spread and time intervals between the crimes. The attack on Lisa had been opportunistic rather than premeditated, Bob explained. He had been making his rounds when he encountered Lisa in the employee parking lot, struggling with a flat tire on her Honda. When he offered assistance, Lisa had gratefully accepted help from the trusted security guard she knew from work. Bob had suggested driving her home in his personal vehicle while they arranged for her car to be repaired the next day. The sexual assault and murder had occurred in Bob's basement, a location he had prepared specifically for such encounters. Over the years, he had been planning and fantasizing about attacking hospital employees. Lisa's body had been disposed of in a remote section of the Cascade National Forest, approximately 60 miles from Salem, where Bob had spent weekends hiking and identifying locations that would never be discovered by casual visitors. The security office key found in Lisa's car had been planted there deliberately, Bob admitted, as a way to confuse investigators and create false leads that would divert attention from his involvement. As the person responsible for hospital security, he had access to all keys and had chosen that particular item because he knew it would puzzle investigators without pointing directly toward him. Bob's confession also revealed his psychological motivation for inserting himself into the search efforts and maintaining contact with Margaret Harper over the years. The knowledge that he alone possessed the answers that desperate family members sought had provided him with a sense of power and control that became addictive. Watching Margaret's basement investigation and listening to her theories about what might have happened to Lisa had been a source of entertainment and satisfaction that he had been unwilling to give up. Justice and aftermath. Bob Wilson entered a guilty plea to 4 counts of aggravated murder on September 18, 2015, 28 years after Lisa Harper's disappearance. The courtroom was packed with family members of his victims, hospital employees who had worked alongside him for decades, and members of a community struggling to understand how they had trusted their safety to a predator for nearly 3 decades. Margaret Harper, now 71 years old, sat in the front row as Bob provided detailed directions to the locations where he had disposed of his victims' remains. Her hands shook as she listened to the man she had spoken with hundreds of times during her investigation describe exactly what had happened to her daughter during her final hours. The woman who had spent 28 years searching for answers finally had them, but the truth proved more devastating than any of the theories she had constructed in her basement command center. The recovery of Lisa Harper's remains from the Cascade National Forest took 3 weeks and required specialized equipment to excavate the remote burial site that Bob had selected for its inaccessibility. Lisa's parents, both now in their 70s, were finally able to hold the funeral service they had been planning for 28 years, laying their daughter to rest in the Salem Pioneer Cemetery, where her headstone could mark an end to their decades of uncertainty. Bob Wilson was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a decision that provided legal closure while failing to address the broader questions about institutional security and background screening that his case had exposed. His employment at St. Mary's Hospital had never been subjected to the kind of psychological evaluation or enhanced background investigation that became standard practice in later decades, allowing him to work around vulnerable patients and staff members while concealing his predatory nature. The hospital implemented new security protocols and screening procedures in response to Bob's crimes, changes that came too late to protect his victims but might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The case also prompted legislative changes in Oregon, requiring more comprehensive background checks and psychological evaluations for hospital employees who have access to sensitive areas and vulnerable populations. Margaret Harper closed her basement investigation center for the final time on Christmas Eve 2015, packing away 28 years of evidence and research that had consumed her adult life. She donated Lisa's case files to the Salem Police Department and used her remaining savings to establish a scholarship fund for nursing students at Chemiquetta Community College, ensuring that her daughter's memory would be preserved through the education of future caregivers. The community of Salem continues to grapple with questions about how effectively predators can hide within positions of trust and responsibility. Bob Wilson's case demonstrated that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most trustworthy, using their positions and reputations as camouflage for activities that violate every principle they claim to represent. For those who followed Lisa Harper's case from the beginning, her story serves as a reminder that justice, when it finally arrives, often brings as many questions as answers about the nature of evil and the vulnerability of the institutions we trust to protect us.